Have you ever found yourself in a crowded room, surrounded by people, yet feeling utterly alone? Or maybe in the quiet of your own space, that familiar ache of loneliness creeps in, wrapping itself around your heart like an invisible shroud. Loneliness, it's a silent struggle many of us face, yet it remains one of the most misunderstood and overlooked emotions in our lives. In a world that prides itself on connection, social media, instant messaging, endless streams of information, how is it that so many people feel isolated? It seems paradoxical, doesn't it? We're more connected than ever, yet loneliness is on the rise. This isn't just a coincidence. Loneliness is more than just a feeling. It's a deep, unsettling experience that touches the core of our being. But what if I told you that Buddhism, a tradition thousands of years old, offers profound wisdom on this very human struggle? Not just vague platitudes or temporary fixes, but a deep, transformative way to understand and work with loneliness. Buddhism doesn't ignore loneliness. It invites us to face it head-on, with compassion and insight. Loneliness, from the Buddhist perspective, isn't simply about being physically alone. It's about a sense of disconnection from ourselves, from others, and even from the world around us. It's a kind of suffering, a form of what the Buddha called dukkha, that pervasive dissatisfaction or unease that underlies much of human experience. Yet within this struggle lies a powerful invitation, the chance to look deeply into the nature of loneliness and discover something unexpected, freedom from it. The Buddha taught that suffering, including loneliness, is not a permanent condition. It's something we can understand, transform, and ultimately transcend. This journey starts by recognizing loneliness as a teacher rather than an enemy. When we shy away or suppress this feeling, it gains strength, deepening our isolation. But when we meet loneliness with mindfulness and kindness, it opens a door. Behind that door lies a path not just to relief, but to profound connection and awakening. So why does loneliness arise in the first place? What makes it so persistent and painful? And how can ancient Buddhist teachings guide us through the maze of isolation toward genuine peace? These questions are the heartbeat of this exploration. We'll walk together through the Buddhist understanding of loneliness, uncovering its roots in the illusions of self and attachment. We'll learn how the teachings on impermanence and non-self offer fresh eyes to see loneliness as a passing cloud rather than an endless storm. We'll explore practical meditation practices that help us sit with loneliness without fear, and the transformative power of compassion, both for ourselves and others. More than that, we'll see how the Buddhist community, the Sangha, plays a vital role in healing loneliness by nurturing connection and belonging. And perhaps most importantly, we'll discover how solitude, the chosen mindful aloneness, can be a source of wisdom and growth rather than despair. Loneliness is part of the human condition, but it doesn't have to be a prison. Through the lens of Buddhism, it becomes a doorway, a sacred invitation to awaken to the truth of our interconnectedness and the boundless compassion that lies within. As we begin this journey, I invite you to lean in, to open your heart and mind. Let's uncover together how the ancient wisdom of Buddhism offers not just comfort, but real transformation for those silent moments when loneliness feels overwhelming. Because loneliness, as we'll see, isn't the end of the story. It's only the beginning. Loneliness often feels like an empty room inside us, echoing with silence. But what lies beneath that emptiness? What makes loneliness grip us so tightly, refusing to loosen its hold? Buddhism points to a powerful insight. Loneliness springs from attachment, our deep craving for connection, approval, and a fixed sense of self. We all want to be seen, understood, and loved. Yet paradoxically, this very desire can fuel our sense of isolation. Imagine this. We tend to believe there's a solid, separate me inside, a distinct identity that must be protected and sustained. This illusion of self is one of Buddhism's core teachings to investigate. The Buddha called this illusion anatta, or non-self, revealing that the self we cling to is not a fixed entity but a constantly changing flow of experiences, thoughts, and feelings. When we believe in a solid self, loneliness feels like a chasm between me and others. It's as if we're stranded islands, surrounded by vast, cold oceans of separation. Our minds spin stories of lack. I'm alone because I'm not enough, or nobody truly understands me. These thoughts deepen the sense of isolation, creating a cycle that's hard to break. But here's the key. The sense of separation is just that, a sense, a perception created by the mind. It's not ultimate truth. When we begin to see through this illusion, the walls between self and other start to dissolve. Attachment is like a magnet pulling us toward people, possessions, or ideas, hoping to fill a void. Yet this magnet always falls short because what we seek is not outside. It's a peace and wholeness we must find within. Buddhism doesn't say, stop caring or shut down your heart. Instead, it invites us to loosen the grip of attachment and to understand the true nature of the self. When the sense of a permanent, separate self fades, loneliness loses its power. The feeling of aloneness gives way to an awareness of connection not only to other people, but to all beings and the world itself. It's important to distinguish loneliness from solitude here. Solitude can be a nourishing space, a chance to rest, reflect, and reconnect with our inner life. Loneliness, however, is usually accompanied by suffering and a sense of disconnection. The Buddha himself spent time in solitude, not as a punishment or exile, but as a deliberate practice to understand the mind deeply. This mindful solitude helped him realize the impermanent and interdependent nature of all things, including the self. So, loneliness arises because of attachment and the mistaken belief in a separate, unchanging self. It's a story our minds tell, but it's not the only story. Recognizing this is the first step toward freedom. It's the moment when we stop fighting loneliness and start looking into its heart with curiosity and courage. By doing so, we open the door to deeper understanding, an understanding that will be supported by the practices and teachings to come. Our next step is to explore how the insight into impermanence, the constant flow of change, helps us transform loneliness from a source of suffering into a passing experience that reveals the nature of life itself. Loneliness often feels like a heavy, unchanging weight pressing down on our hearts. It seems permanent, as if it will last forever. But what if the feeling of loneliness is as fleeting as a passing cloud, here for a moment, then drifting away? This is where the Buddhist teaching of impermanence comes in, a truth that everything in life is constantly changing, flowing, and transforming. Nothing is fixed or eternal, including our emotions and the sense of loneliness itself. Imagine watching a wave rise and fall in the ocean. The wave appears solid and real, but it's only a temporary shape made of water in motion. Just like the wave, our feelings come and go. Loneliness, no matter how intense it feels right now, is not a permanent condition. It's part of the natural ebb and flow of our inner experience. This understanding can be incredibly freeing. When we realize that loneliness is impermanent, we can begin to relate to it differently, not as an enemy to fight or a prison to escape, but as a visitor passing through. This is where mindfulness becomes our greatest ally. Mindfulness means paying attention to the present moment with openness and without judgment. It's the practice of simply noticing what's happening inside us, the sensations, thoughts, and emotions, without trying to change or avoid them. When loneliness arises, mindfulness invites us to observe it carefully. We notice where we feel it in the body. Is it a tightness in the chest, a heaviness in the stomach? We listen to the thoughts that accompany loneliness, the stories we tell ourselves, and recognize them as just that. Stories. By witnessing loneliness with mindfulness, something remarkable happens. The feeling loses its grip. We stop being swept away by fear or despair. Instead, we become calm observers, creating space between ourselves and the emotion. This space is powerful. It allows us to respond to loneliness with kindness rather than fear. we might gently remind ourselves, "This feeling will change. I am not alone in this experience." This simple act of turning toward loneliness with compassion is a radical shift. Meditation practices in Buddhism often focus on this kind of mindful awareness. Sitting quietly, breathing naturally, we learn to hold all feelings, pleasant or unpleasant, with a steady heart. Over time, the intensity of loneliness softens, replaced by a gentle acceptance. This doesn't mean loneliness disappears overnight. Rather, it means we develop the resilience to be with loneliness without being overwhelmed by it. We discover that within the flux of emotions, there is a stable center, a grounded presence that remains untouched by passing storms. The wisdom of impermanence and the skill of mindfulness work together like two wings, lifting us above the turbulence of loneliness. They remind us that life, with all its challenges, is a journey of constant change, and that we have the capacity to meet every feeling with courage and grace. As we cultivate this awareness, we also awaken to a deeper truth, that our connection to others and to ourselves is not based on clinging or fear, but on a shared humanity that flows through every moment. This understanding naturally leads us to the next step, the healing power of compassion. Because once we see loneliness clearly without fear, our hearts can open wider, both to ourselves and to the world. When loneliness whispers its cold, hollow song, it can feel like a barrier has risen between us and the rest of the world, a wall that no one can climb. But Buddhism teaches us that this wall is not impenetrable. It can be softened, even melted, by the warmth of compassion and loving kindness. Compassion, or K-A-R-U letter 1E47A macron, is the heart's natural response to suffering, both our own and that of others. It's not just a sentimental feeling. It's a powerful force that reaches out to heal the divisions loneliness creates. When we cultivate compassion, we begin to dissolve the sense of I versus you, replacing it with a deep recognition of shared experience. Loving kindness, or metta, is the practice of wishing happiness and well-being for all beings, including ourselves. It's an active, deliberate sending of goodwill, a bridge built from the heart across the divide of isolation. Loneliness often traps us in self-judgment and harsh inner voices. I am unworthy. No one cares. These thoughts reinforce the illusion of separateness and deepen our suffering. But through loving-kindness meditation, we learn to extend gentle care inward, breaking the cycle of self-criticism. Imagine sitting quietly and repeating simple phrases like, "May I be safe. May I be happy. May I be free from suffering." These words carry a balm for the lonely heart. Gradually, we internalize a kinder, more nurturing relationship with ourselves. From this foundation, the practice naturally expands outward toward friends, strangers, even those we find difficult. We begin to see that all beings share the universal longing for connection, acceptance, and peace. This shared longing connects us in a profound way. Loneliness begins to loosen its grip as our hearts open to the reality that we are not alone in our suffering. Compassion becomes the thread that weaves together our broken parts, reminding us that connection is always possible, even in moments of solitude. The Buddha emphasized that true healing doesn't come from avoiding loneliness, but from meeting it with an open, compassionate heart. When we do this, we transform loneliness from a source of pain into a doorway to empathy and love. This transformation isn't always easy. It requires courage to face the vulnerability that loneliness exposes. But with each act of kindness, whether toward ourselves or others, we take a step toward healing. And healing through compassion is not just an individual journey, it's a communal one. Buddhist communities, or Sanghas, offer a living example of how connection nourishes the soul. In the Sangha, practitioners come together to support one another, sharing their struggles and their joys, reminding us that belonging is possible. In the next chapter, we'll explore practical ways to cultivate this compassionate connection, not only through meditation but through our daily lives. How do we reach out and build bridges that overcome loneliness? How can simple acts of kindness transform our relationships and ourselves? Because in the end, healing loneliness is about opening the heart, over and over again, to the world and to the people who share this human experience with us. Loneliness often feels like standing alone in a vast wilderness, surrounded by silence and emptiness. But in Buddhism, there is a profound antidote to this solitude, the Sangha, the spiritual community. The Sangha is not just a group of people. It's a living, breathing support system rooted in shared practice, compassion, and understanding. It's a sanctuary where we can shed the masks we wear in daily life and meet others with honesty and acceptance. Historically, the Buddha established the Sangha as one of the three jewels, along with the Buddha himself and the Dharma, his teachings, as a refuge for seekers on the path. Why? Because no one truly walks this path alone. In the Sangha, we encounter others who understand the struggles of the heart, the loneliness, doubts, and fears that arise when we turn inward. This shared understanding creates a powerful sense of belonging, reminding us that our pain is not isolated. Imagine walking into a room filled with people who have faced their own battles with loneliness. Here, there is no judgment, only kindness. Through shared meditation, chanting, study, and conversation, a deep connection forms, a web of mutual support and encouragement. This spiritual community nurtures us in ways that go beyond casual friendships. It holds space for vulnerability and growth. In the Sangha, we learn the art of compassionate listening, offering presence rather than quick fixes. We witness each other's transformation, knowing that healing is a collective journey. Participation in a Sangha also encourages discipline and consistency in practice, which is essential for working through loneliness. Regular gatherings provide rhythm and structure, anchors in the often turbulent sea of our minds. Moreover, the Sangha reflects the Buddhist teaching of interdependence, or pratityasamutpada. This principle reveals that we are not separate beings, but intricately connected through countless causes and conditions. Loneliness diminishes when we see ourselves as part of this vast, interconnected web. But what if you don't have access to a physical Sangha? Buddhism recognizes that spiritual community can take many forms: online groups, meditation centers, or simply deep connections with like-minded individuals. The essence remains the same. Authentic connection nourishes the heart and diminishes loneliness. The power of Sangha lies in its ability to remind us that even in solitude, we are never truly alone. Each smile, each shared breath, each compassionate word is a thread weaving us back into the fabric of life. As we move forward, we'll explore how the wisdom gained from Sangha and spiritual practice empowers us to transform loneliness into a gateway, a doorway to deeper insight, compassion, and ultimately, liberation. Loneliness is often seen as something to avoid, a painful void we desperately seek to fill. But what if loneliness is not an enemy, but a hidden teacher, a path leading us toward profound wisdom and self-discovery? In Buddhism, solitude is not mere isolation. It is a sacred space where transformation happens. When we embrace loneliness with openness, we create room for insight to emerge. The silence around us becomes a mirror reflecting the deeper landscape of our minds and hearts. Many great Buddhist masters have walked this path of solitude, not as a punishment or a curse, but as a conscious choice, a retreat into stillness to cultivate understanding beyond the noise of everyday life. Loneliness invites us to slow down, to turn inward, and to confront the very core of our being. It reveals the patterns of attachment and aversion that have shaped our experience. In this quietness, we begin to see clearly what has been hidden beneath the surface: fears, desires, hopes, and the illusions we cling to. This facing of loneliness can be uncomfortable. It stirs feelings of vulnerability and uncertainty. Yet within this discomfort lies the seed of growth. By leaning into solitude rather than running from it, we build resilience and deepen our capacity for compassion, both for ourselves and others. The Buddha taught that suffering, including loneliness, can be a doorway to awakening. When we fully experience loneliness without distraction or resistance, we touch the impermanent nature of all things. This realization softens our grip on the self, the very source of loneliness, and opens us to the boundless nature of awareness. Solitude, then, is not emptiness but fullness, a fullness of presence, understanding, and peace. It's a fertile ground where wisdom blossoms, and where the heart learns to rest quietly in its own space. Practicing meditation during times of loneliness helps us cultivate this embrace. Sitting with the breath, observing sensations and thoughts without judgment, we discover a deep well of calm beneath the surface agitation. This inner refuge becomes a source of strength, enabling us to face life's inevitable ups and downs with grace. Loneliness transforms from a painful burden into a profound teacher, guiding us toward authenticity and freedom. As we learn to walk this path, we begin to cherish solitude not as loneliness, but as a precious opportunity, a chance to grow, heal, and awaken to the true nature of our being. Next, we will reflect on how to integrate these insights into our everyday lives, transforming loneliness into a source of connection and meaning that enriches every moment. Loneliness, with all its quiet weight, is a universal part of the human experience. It is not a failing, nor a flaw. It is a signal, a call to look deeper within and beyond. Through the lens of Buddhism, loneliness is transformed from a prison of isolation into a gateway to awakening. We've journeyed together, exploring the nature of loneliness, the illusions of self and attachment that deepen our sense of separation. We've seen how mindfulness helps us witness loneliness without fear, and how compassion and loving kindness open our hearts to healing. We discovered the power of the Sangha, a spiritual community that holds us when loneliness feels overwhelming. And we embraced solitude not as a curse but as a path to wisdom, where the seeds of growth and transformation quietly take root. This is the essence of the Buddhist approach, meeting suffering with awareness, kindness, and connection. Loneliness is not erased overnight, but through practice and patience, it becomes a teacher, a doorway to profound understanding and peace. When we stop fighting loneliness, stop pushing it away or masking it with distractions, we find something unexpected: freedom. Freedom from the need to define ourselves by our fears or our isolation. Freedom to rest in the ever-present connection that underlies all existence. So, if you felt this silent struggle, know that you are not alone. There is a path forward, illuminated by the timeless wisdom of the Buddha and supported by the community of fellow seekers. If this journey resonates with you, and you want to explore more about Buddhist teachings and how they can transform your life, please subscribe to our channel. Hit the like button if this video brought you comfort or insight, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. Together, let's continue walking this path of awakening, turning loneliness into a source of strength, compassion, and profound peace. Thank you for being here.